In white letters on black, the space. Sitting side by side in a black space, looking glum, and with a faraway look in their eyes, are mustachioed Denis, long dark-haired Rosalia, long fair-haired Alice, bearded, curly-haired Fred, and with straggly, shoulder-length, chestnut-coloured hair, Mavis. Candoco Dance Company. Mavis shrugs her shoulders, triggering a chain reaction. Fred leans back, Alice rests her head on her hand, Rosalia leans forward, head bowed, and Denis folds his arms. Unspoken Spoken. In a white space, the narrator signs.
Once at school, we lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. The teacher came round with chalk and drew our outlines. The classroom floor looked like a tray of gingerbread cookie cutters. We all drew inside our chalk outlines, apart from one girl in the corner who was scribbling furiously. "Stop where you get to the outline," the teacher said. "Why?" asked the girl. "Because that's where you end."
In a white, claustrophobic space that tapers off to a door, Rosalia is sat sullenly at a square table which has a vase of dead flowers on it. She slumps on the table in a movement that suggests giving up, then leans back in her chair before slowly standing up and resting her hands on the table, pushing herself off the floor. Blank-faced, she slumps back into her chair. Dressed in grey, her husband wanders in, eyes fixed on Rosalia. She stands up and he moves the chair away, standing beside her behind the table. She moves when he tries to touch her gently. They flit around the table and she reels away as he tries to get close to her. She spins slowly and he gradually puts an arm around her, picking her up by the waist and turning her around. She pushes down on his hands and he shuffles her back to the table. She turns her back to him and he picks her up and spins her around before wandering away. Fred leans on the back of the chair as Rosalia rests her hands on the table, spinning back and forth towards him. She backs away, putting more and more distance between them. The space, minus the table and chair, is now occupied by a female authority figure dressed in grey, and 14-year-old Alice, who is a double lower leg amputee. The woman spins Alice by her shoulders, then taking her arm, she lifts her, throwing her gently across the floor. Alice lifts herself up by her hands to spin around. The woman locks eyes with Alice, and as Alice shuffles closer, the woman turns and walks away. Alice is now alone in the space with the table and the vase of dead flowers beneath it. She looks back to where the woman exited. Alice then clamps her hands on the sides of the table tentatively and pulls herself up onto it. Balancing on her hands, she goes to each side of the table, hovering on the edge, pushing against the table, frustrated with how she was treated. She climbs down onto the floor, shuffling away from the table. She glances over her shoulder, then returns to the table, clutching one of the legs. She moves over to another leg, holding it firmly and hiding behind it, before moving underneath the table, hiding her head in her arms as she lifts her pelvis up. She curls up and goes to sleep, not knowing how to answer back. We next see the narrator in a white, empty space.
"Because that's where you end," said the teacher. "No, I don't," said the girl, and added a tail and antlers to her outline. Like a slow wave, the goosebumps of contagion prickled across the classroom floor.
There are now two tables next to each other, Denis sits at one table and a man in grey, representing Denis's potential lover, is sitting at the other. The vase of dead flowers is on Denis's table. They look across at each other, feeling awkward and nervous, flirting. They each cough and look to the floor. Fred rests his chin on his hand pensively, and Denis does the same. They both giggle at different points. Fred looks across at Denis, his body language open. Denis is closed. One table has disappeared. The two men sit at either end of the remaining table and repeat the same gestures. Then both tables disappear and the men are sitting side by side, leaning forward, mirroring one another's pensive positions, repeating the same gestures. They lean back in their chairs, but Denis appears apprehensive. Denis smiles nervously. Fred smiles and mimics Denis's cough. Their eyes meet, and Fred pulls Denis to his feet. Fred turns away, and Denis moves closer to him apprehensively. Fred takes Denis's hand, then entwines his arms around him. Denis's arms are around his potential lover, who disentangles himself from Denis, and Denis moves in close as if to kiss him. The man puts his arm around Denis's waist and takes his hand as they do a slow dance, resting their heads on one another's shoulders. Fred picks up Denis, who clings onto him tightly. They separate for a moment. The man looks at Denis's hand on his shoulder and turns around to fall backwards into his arms. Denis supports the man. The man turns and crouches down to lift Denis up off the floor, holding him tenderly, with Denis surrendering in his arms. The man returns Denis to the floor, and Denis stares into his eyes somberly. Denis trudges away, around the table that now separates them. With a defiant look in his eyes, Denis pushes the table towards the man, who walks away looking confused. Denis slowly rests his head on the table, as if it were a pillow. He slowly pushes himself up, resting his hands on the table. He crouches down, leaning mournfully on the edge of the table. In a white space without the door, Mavis, who uses a wheelchair, pushes back against a woman dressed in grey who is trying to control her. The woman lifts herself up on Mavis's shoulders, but Mavis shrugs her off and the woman walks away. In a white space, Fred is sitting in a chair with a woman and a man dressed identically in grey either side of him. They take it in turns to push and pull him, each one representing Fred's internal struggle between his head and his heart. Fred spins off the chair towards the table and pushes against it out of frustration. He falls back off it, then springs to his feet, desperately pushing at the table. He leaps onto the table like a deranged animal, then jumps back down onto the floor. He leans on the table with his arms, his legs at a right angle beneath the table, sliding to the floor before leaping back to his feet and spinning the table round slightly. He stretches an arm across the table. He straightens up, exhausted and defeated. And shift back to Mavis, who is now in the space. Using her whole body, she pushes against the table, moving it across the floor. She desperately tries to upturn the table. She scrabbles at the table with her hands. Emotionally, she feels stuck in her frustration and anger. Her face, contorted with effort, gradually relaxes and she opens her eyes. What has she realised?
The cookie cutter shapes burst their banks. The floor turned into a river. The river into a dragon. The dragon spilt out of the classroom and lit up the sky. Whenever I watch people in groups, I'm reminded of that day. Any new idea, no, that's not the word, any new normal, any new change begins with small, individual actions that multiply across the masses, until in the end, no one knows if it's you who created the momentum or whether the momentum created you.
From left to right, Denis, Rosalia, Alice, Fred and Mavis are sat side by side in the black space from the opening scene. They look fed up and are fidgeting, seemingly waiting for something and looking out to the viewer. Denis and Rosalia stand up and sit down in unison. Alice joins in, mirroring their movements as they perch on the edge of their seats, as if to get up before slumping back and coughing with a hand over the mouth. Gradually, Fred joins in, leaning forward and back, turning to look at Mavis, who is frowning. All the time, the pace is increasing and the tension building. They all move forward to a huge table containing numerous vases of dead flowers and upturn the table. All the dead flowers and vases go crashing to the floor. Back in the white space, with the door in the background, for a moment there is an empty space. Then Fred and Alice spin and glide round and over each other, wreathed in smiles, moving with an energy that is light and playful. Alice grabs Fred by the arm, throwing him to the floor, and she climbs onto his back. He picks her up, and she shuffles along, doing a handstand. He picks her up again and twirls her around in his arms. She launches herself off his back into a handstand, and they both walk on their hands. They look at each other and giggle. Alone in the space, Rosalia crouches down, then stretches up high. She swings her arms, and with hands clasped together, reaches up. Her movements assured, weighty, free and confident. She spins and drops down onto her hands, then gets up and strides away. As Rosalia departs, Mavis enters, circling the space. She stops and rotates her head and neck. Then her shoulders. And her torso. She circles in her wheelchair, looking up with a painful and fearful expression. Rosalia enters, taking Mavis's hands. They both lean their heads back, hands clasped, arms outstretched. They let go. Rosalia leans into Mavis, who lifts her up. Rosalia is returned to the floor. She takes Mavis's arm, gently supporting her. Mavis lets her head fall to one side. Rosalia folds her body over Mavis's shoulder and, supported by Mavis, lifts her feet off the floor. Rosalia gets down and Mavis circles her, looking suspicious, but a smile spreads across her lips and she nods. They exit the space together. Alone in the space, Denis stretches out his tattooed arms to his sides as he looks up. He draws in his arms and bows his head, but then gradually extends his arms and his fingers like a tree growing in size and strength. He leans his head back, eyes to the heavens, stretching and stretching his arms and fingers wide and long. The rest of his body feels anchored to the ground. He draws in his arms and hands, looking relaxed and confident. He turns to see Fred approaching. Fred stands beside him, gently holding Denis's wrist and with a hand on his shoulder. Mavis joins them and leans her head against Fred. Rosalia arrives and perches on the arm of Mavis's wheelchair, followed by Alice, who leans against Rosalia's legs. They each look solemn and peaceful, frozen in a tableau, physically connected to one another. The tableau dissolves as they break into joyous smiles. Produced by Candoco Dance Company, Mavis, Julie Cleaves, Denis, Dan Dorr, Alice, Jessica Dowdeswell, Fred, Thomasin Gilgeck, narrator Jemima Hoadley, Rosalia, Roberta Petra, director and choreographer Finn Walker, film director Ross McGibbon, music and sound composed and produced by Ben Park and Park Music, writer Ed Harris, designer John Bowser, set designer Alfie Haywood, costume designer Becky Gunstone, makeup artists Louisa Copperwaite and Laura Barrow, executive producer for the space Helen Spencer, producer Janie Valentine, access consultant Deepa Shastri. This film is supported by the Space, Arts Council England and BBC.